Hi, this is Jeff Blauette, technical agronomist with Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and on this week's Field Friday segment, as we get kind of close to the finish line on this corn here, I thought we'd kind of talk about a couple of methods to do some hand yield estimates to kind of get a feel for what you have out there for a crop this year. We're starting to get into that stage. Silage is starting to go. Things are progressing pretty rapidly. So we're kind of getting to the point where the corn's far enough along we can get a pretty good feel for what's out there. So I thought we'd talk about a couple methods to do that. One that's fairly common is it's called the kernel count method. Basically, you want to go out into the field, step off or measure off with a tape measure 1/1000th of an acre, count how many viable harvestable ears you have in that strip, and then get that number, write that down, and then you might have a 31 or 33 or 29, whatever, and then grab randomly 3 or 4 ears. I like to grab the 5th, 10th, and 15th ear. You can grab the 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, whatever. But whatever you grab, then the next goal is to figure out the average number of kernels, length of all 4 or all 3 ears, however many you grab, and figure out your average kernel length and number. And then you take how many kernel rows are around those ears, and you figure out what the average is there. So you're figuring out your average ear size. And then you take those two numbers times each other. You might have 16.33 average kernel rows around by the time you average those 3 or 4 ears out. You might have 34 kernel length long as your average length of an ear. You take those two numbers times each other, and then you take that maybe 550 kernels or whatever that might be on that average ear in that sample, and you take that times your stand count, which if you had 31 plants that you counted with a harvestable ear, you take that 550 kernels times 31,000, that'll give you a big number. That number you would take out, depending on what you expect that kernel weight to be. If it's drought stressed or smaller kernels, maybe that number is 95,000 kernels per bushel. If it's really heavy test weight or had a really nice kernel depth, maybe that number is as low as 80,000 kernels per bushel. So you kind of got to make your own little guesstimate here of what you think you're having out there for kernels. But the average probably is somewhere between 85 and 90 typically, but we've seen as high as 100, and we've seen as low as 75,000 kernels per bushel. So there's a little bit of a guesstimate there, but I would say if you shoot for somewhere in that average, unless you know it's really small and shrunk down kernels, you got to kind of use the bigger number to get an accurate estimate. But that's the simplest way to kind of get a range. There's another method that's probably more accurate, takes a little bit more time, and it's more involved. But basically what that's doing, and it works better if you wait till you get black layered corn. We're not there yet on anything really, so that's a little more difficult right now, but we're going to get there fairly soon. But if you go out there and do the same thing, do your stand count, get your average number of plants out there, and then you grab those same ears, but instead of doing a kernel count, we're going to take those ears and weigh them, and you can figure out a way to get an average weight. And then you take the kernels and shell them off, and you're basically going to get a weight that you're going to be able to use. You got to have that moisture sample to give you if it's 29% moisture, 30% moisture, whatever it is if you're doing it fairly early. But there's a formula here that I'll put a link on the screen here that will give you the procedure you can follow to try and get an accurate yield estimate. That's probably better because you don't have to worry about is it a 85,000, 95,000 kernels per bushel. This is actually weighing it. So that's more accurate. That's what a lot of the federal crop adjusters do to get you a better average yield estimate on what you're doing. So just thought I'd kind of touch on a couple of things you can do to kind of get out there and see what your fields look like and what yields you might have, and kind of give you some idea how much for bushels you might be able to start marketing potentially. So I'll put that website link here. It's a little easier if you pull that up rather than me explain it all and you have to write it all down. This will be an easier way for you, but just a couple of ways to get your yield estimates done for you. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.